some of the most unexplained occurrences take place in the forested regions of the world. From people that believe that they were almost taken, to others that went missing and then returned. Today's show focuses on the unsettling phenomena that several eyewitnesses have experienced. Phenomena that may be proof of something sinister dwelling within the wilderness.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7-8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, and thank you for being here. I am your host, Nick Ryan. I'd like to start the show by saying thank you to our listeners, and of course, our supporters on Patreon. I'd also like to welcome our newest patrons, Jordan, Andrea, Colt, and Annalyssa. Your support and generosity is amazing, and it makes our podcast possible. For a full list of our wonderful supporters, please see the show notes. At one time or another, it's likely that we've all experienced the feeling of being watched, only to turn around and realize that no one is there. This phenomenon has become known as the psychic staring effect, sometimes referred to as scopisthesia. The idea was first explored by psychologist Edward B. Titchener in 1898, after students in his junior classes reported being able to feel when somebody was looking at them, even though they could not see this person. Titchener then performed a series of laboratory experiments, which seemed to find mostly negative results. The effect has been subject of contemporary attention from parapsychologists and fringe researchers from the 1980s onwards, and has prompted many more studies in recent years that have led to inconclusive results as well. But could it be that this sensation, while not provable on paper, is indeed proof that someone or something is lurking just beyond our comprehension, warning us that imminent danger could be near? I think it's easier to disregard this feeling when you're with others or in a public place, but the sensation of scopisthesia becomes even more disconcerting when you know you're by yourself, but you feel it nonetheless. Maybe you're at home enjoying a relaxing evening alone, or perhaps out hiking on an isolated trail, when you get the distinct notion that something is staring at you. In many cases, this is accompanied by the hair on your neck standing up, the presence of goosebumps, and sometimes even the feeling of dread. This scenario has been experienced by hundreds, if not thousands, of people, and it's a phenomenon that seems to have direct correlations to some very unsettling eyewitness accounts that are taking place around the world. As we discussed in our last episode, many of these experiences seem to happen in or around wilderness areas, with the witnesses describing almost the exact same phenomena, some of them believing that they were almost taken by some sort of mysterious entity or energy. Last week we began talking about some of these cases, and I'd like to continue on that path with our first story of the day, which comes to us from an article on Mysterious Universe. This experience comes from a man who says he is a U.S. Armed Forces veteran on the East Coast, and that on this day, he and his young son had set out on a leisurely hike on a calm, clear day along a trail that was very clear and well-maintained, with frequent clear trail markers. Yet as they walked, the eyewitness says that things began to seem somewhat off, with the trail markers suddenly disappearing as they walked, and a strange silence swept over the area. As he stood there puzzled by the sudden wall of quiet, the silence was broken by a loud, startling snap, and he explains what happened next. He says, "This is where things got surreal. As I looked back, I noticed that the trail I was walking on lost all sense of familiarity. There were trees I didn't see, certain plants I know for sure weren't there before, etc. But regardless, I kept my composure and stared deeply into the woods to see what made that snapping sound. I scanned the area and didn't see any life forms, but for some reason, my eyes started to fixate on a particularly unnerving, dark section of the forest. For whatever reason, my entire body started locking up, and every single alarm bell in my head was pinging. No matter how hard I tried to focus on this dark patch, I couldn't see anything. I had the weirdest sensation of being able to see each individual branch and plant in high detail, but I couldn't focus on the scene overall. It was super blurry. I also felt my internal fight or flight mechanism flipping between the two decisions, faster than a coin in a coin toss. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to figure out why my senses were not working anymore. This instinctual part of my brain was screaming that there was something there, but I absolutely could not observe it. Whatever light was in this area seemed to bend around this central point, somewhat like how a cloaking device works. It was a minor distortion, but enough to make it strangely obvious. I then noticed how I hadn't heard a peep from the forest this entire time, and I was feeling very cold, even during 85+ degree weather. I could not shake this feeling of impending doom, probably what one feels when they are on their deathbed. I felt exceptionally vulnerable because I was not armed and had no way of dealing with whatever the hell this was. Eventually, I was able to snap out of my trance briefly to look down at my son, who was frozen and staring exactly where this anomaly was, with his mouth agape and his eyes wide and dilated. This is when I knew I wasn't hallucinating and that we needed to get the hell out of there. I took advantage of my brief moment of clarity and ran like the wind, with my son in tow. I looked back only once and saw that my boy was still looking toward the area, but not frozen in place anymore. It took all of about a couple minutes to get out past the tree line and onto a main road. For whatever reason, I broke down and started crying. My son looked at me like I was crazy. I had never felt such sheer terror over what seemed like nothing in my whole life. I hadn't felt that way at all in any point of my life, in fact. The feeling that my son and I were completely vulnerable and that I wouldn't have been able to defend either of us. I also have never had the distinct feeling of being able to see things perfectly, yet not be able to register any of it in my head. My morbid curiosity wants me to revisit this place, equipped with a firearm and a GoPro to record any events that would arise, but I'm still trying to get over this previous experience for now. I have been in scary situations before, but this trumps anything I have ever experienced. It's interesting to note with this case the presence of that dark patch he mentions. What connection does this have to the strange experience, if any? Was it maybe some sort of entity stalking them for inscrutable, nefarious purposes? In some of these reports, there definitely does seem to be some malevolent presence involved, as is the case with an account by Reddit user Justa33556, who had his alleged encounter while on a hike with his girlfriend at Starved Rock State Park in Illinois. He says they came across an area where the trees had branches broken off about 8 feet up, which they both considered to be quite odd, and making it stranger still was that he suddenly got the unshakable sensation that he was being intently watched, practically feeling eyes boring into the back of his skull. They continued on their walk and could even see other hikers in the area, but he could not determine from where the persistent, intense sensation of being watched was coming from. He claims that he increasingly felt that they were being followed, and that's when the true strangeness would set in. He reports the following. Every time I walked forward, it felt like someone was behind me, so I kept turning around to check. I told my girlfriend to go in front of me, and let her go about 20 feet in front. So I turned around not more than 30 seconds since the last time I looked, and there is this woman coming up on me fast. It was bizarre. She was walking when I first spotted her, but her speed was much faster than her gait would take her. It was like she was on a people mover escalator, like in the airports. She was coming up fast. I glared at her, and she stopped when our eyes met. I gave her a look like, "What the hell are you doing, coming up on me like that?" She looked completely normal, like a local Chicago lady, mid-50s, bright red winter coat, etc. In hindsight, 2 other things stood out. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling in the woods, nothing before I saw her. At the speed she was moving, she would have had to be running hard, but I didn't hear footsteps. She wasn't breathing hard, and her gait was a walking gait, not running, but she was moving toward me at a running speed. When she stopped, we were less than 20 feet from one another. The next thing that stands out is her features. She had no distinguishing features in her hair, skin, or clothes. No shadowing or skin hues, dimples, etc. As a former criminal investigator, I know to look for distinctive markings. There were none. Even her clothes were a uniform color, yet indistinct in any way. It was like she just stepped out of a department store. After staring at each other for a bit, I felt like I had gotten my point across. She had her head cocked back to her left and looked at me from the corner of her eyes in a slightly alarmed, "You caught me" kind of look. So after I felt I had made my point, I turned around and continued walking. My girlfriend had not seen her and had continued walking. I took about 3 steps and then realized there was no way she could have come up from behind that group of people in the 30 seconds or so since I'd last looked back. There was also nowhere to come from on either side that wasn't visible for hundreds of feet. I said to myself, "No way," and spun back around. She was gone. Simply vanished. I checked the group of people way behind us, and no one had a red coat on. No one else was around, and there were no sounds other than my footfalls. That woman had just vanished. No drugs or alcohol were involved, and both are prohibited in my line of work. It took us about 10 minutes to reach the car, and for the remainder of the walk, I did not feel like I was being stared at or followed anymore. I have never been back there, and I'm never going back there. After reading many missing 411 accounts and the profile of disappearances, I believe that I narrowly averted being snatched by whatever that thing was. I do not think it was a woman that I saw. I think it was something different, which I could not see. What was this entity that he feels was intent on snatching him? Where did it go, and what did it want? Who knows? A similarly ominous experience happened to Reddit user B73086 while on her family's annual camping trip at a tiny remote lake called Lake Almanor, up in Lassen County, California. On this day, her and her cousin decided to take a hike along a creek that meandered through the densely forested area, and as they made their way through the wilderness, they became aware of a faint, rhythmic sound reminiscent of someone beating on a drum. It was weird, but they sort of just shrugged it off and continued on their way. However, as they hiked along, the drumming sounds seemed to get louder, closer, and they became increasingly unnerved by it. That is when they would have a truly surreal experience. And she says this: "The drumming became noticeably louder. It was coming from all around us, in the same steady dull beat. It had a kind of droning quality, and soon I could begin to feel it vibrating in my ears, thudding alongside my heart, inside my body. That was when things began to feel very weird. I no longer felt uneasy, but instead I felt this deep peace, like I was asleep and dreaming. I kept putting one foot in front of the other and climbing the mountain, but it was like I was in a trance, not making the decision to continue, but instead being drawn upwards. We kept walking in total silence for a long time, that sound pounding and getting louder. We reached a place where a waterfall tumbled down a rock ledge, maybe 6 feet overhead. It was an easy walk up and around to get to the next tier of the creek, but I stopped, and my cousin stopped near me. In a daze, we looked at the beautiful pool at the foot of the falls. It was dripping with ferns and moss, and the bottom was formed by small, colorful stones. The beat was faster now, close and enveloping, but seeming to still come from nowhere. I looked at the falls and felt an intense longing to walk up above them, to continue on further up the mountain, and see all the beauty beyond. We were still for such a long time, until finally my cousin said, "I think if we keep going, we don't ever come back." When I looked at her, I knew I felt the same thing, and I felt a splash of adrenaline. We turned and started back down the mountain. As we descended, the foggy feeling began to clear, the beat began to fade, and I felt more and more the urgent need to get away. Finally awake, I was covered in goosebumps, and was leaping and tripping over things to go as fast as I could. We passed the big root system, and both spontaneously said, "Thank you," and started giggling nervously. As we finally hit the meadow, we started to relax, and I laughed and said something like, "Wow, we really have big imaginations." Finally, we crossed the meadow and stopped to turn around and look back. Just then, a loud, sharp, unmistakable "Yep!" echoed down the mountain, emanating from exactly where we'd been. Every hair on my body stood up, and I just knew, that if we hadn't turned around after that waterfall, we would never have left that mountain again. We ran back to camp as fast as we could go. This next story is from the Missing 411 Reddit forum by a poster called Save David Bowie. She says that her experience happened at a place called Stone Mountain State Park in the U.S. state of North Carolina, not far from where she lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and that she is an avid, seasoned hiker and outdoorsman. She says that she has had 2 experiences of being stalked by a seemingly malicious presence in the park, the first of which she says this. This happened last year, while hiking with my boyfriend and our dog. We had seen a couple of waterfalls that day, and we were going to hike to the lower falls. There had been very heavy rainfall for a few days, and I knew this trail has several creek crossings. I decided I didn't want to get wet, and told my boyfriend to go on without me, and I would wait. The falls were only another half-mile or so ahead. My boyfriend and dog went on across the creek and disappeared out of my line of sight. As soon as I couldn't see them anymore, I was suddenly aware of how quiet the woods were. No birds chirping or squirrels rustling leaves. I don't usually get spooked, but all of a sudden I had this overwhelming sense of dread. I felt as if something was watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling. I had an urge to run after my boyfriend and stared at the creek crossing when I saw him dashing back towards me. He too had an overwhelming sense of dread and didn't get 10 minutes down the trail before he turned and ran back to me. He said he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to attack me. This was around 11 a.m. on a Sunday, so not very likely that a big cat or bear would be out at this time. This tense, overwhelming feeling and the abrupt silence of the forest is very common in these types of reports and is often observed by more than one witness. In her second account, we have the same unshakable fear from nowhere, as well as anomalous noises from the trees. This is what she says happened. This incident was very scary, because I was alone with my dog. We were hiking the same section of Stone Mountain, but a different trail called Wolf Rock. On the way up, I had seen many trees that were scorched, but could have been due to lightning. I have pics of the trees, I just assumed it was lightning burns. I started getting an ominous feeling, so I started picking up my pace to head back. When I was about a mile from my car, I heard what only can be described as a supersonic boom. It shook the ground and rattled the trees. It spooked me and my dog so bad, we ran most of the way back to the car. I tried later describing the sound to my boyfriend to no avail, since I never heard anything like it. Not gunfire, not a plane, not a rock slide, which I've heard all before. But while reading another person's story on this sub, it sparked my memory. They described the sound they heard as a giant sledgehammer hitting a tin wall. That's the best way I can describe the noise I heard. That metallic bang, reverberating through the woods. Very unsettling. What could be behind this noise? This metallic noise sometimes pops up in reports like this, and another is a noise that sounds like someone or something knocking a club against a tree, a sort of wood-knocking sound that is usually perceived as very unsettling. We can see this in a report from the same forum, from a poster called Naha Tokyo, who had her experience in the sprawling Algonquin Provincial Park in Ontario, Canada. On this day, she was out canoeing with 2 friends in the park at a place called Rock Lake, and they decided to camp out on shore. It was a very windy evening, but she says she was alarmed when at some point in the middle of the night, the roaring, whipping wind just suddenly stopped, as if it had been simply turned off. It wasn't a slow decrease of wind. It was just there one moment and gone the next, and there were also no sounds of insects anymore, just total silence. She was already alarmed by this, but it was made worse when she could feel an incredible sense of danger and palpable dread all around her. Her friends were still asleep, and she describes the feeling that she had. I wanted to wake my friends, but I thought that they would think I was just overworried. The silence was overbearing, and I began to feel the most intense sense of dread I've ever had, seemingly for no reason. I then heard what sounded like loud knocks on trees in the distance. I don't know what that could have been, but it was making me feel worse. The wind eventually came back after about 20 minutes, and I tried to get more sleep. I was nearly dozed off when I heard a sound in my head, sort of like when you get hurt in video games, like a high-pitched frequency that got higher in frequency as it went on. I had an intense feeling of dread in this moment, and I stayed up till sunrise and couldn't sleep. I didn't even mention it to my friends, because they were asleep, and would probably just shrug it off. The next day, she stayed silent about her weird experience the night before, but it was still very much weighing on her mind when they pushed out to do some more canoeing on the lake. They pushed out toward a place called Rose Island, and it was here where a variety of strange sounds would come from the surrounding wilderness, as if something was out there with them that didn't want them there. She says, "Later we canoed to a place in Rock Lake called Rose Island. On this island, as we collected wood for our fire, I began to hear a variety of weird sounds. The weirdest was a knocking sound, which consisted of 5 very low-frequency knocks, which sped up like this. Knock, 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 knock. I could not think of any animal that would make this sound. I have heard woodpeckers, and they are much higher pitched. We then heard what sounded like wood banging on trees, but from different directions. Later we were hiking, and I saw a black mass in the forest, which looked like a black bear. We ran away and decided to leave camp and come home, because we both had a feeling of complete dread after seeing it." In this report, one wonders if the black object they saw had anything to do with the report, and if so, just how did it connect? Along with the wood knocking, it almost seems as if they might have been terrorized by a Bigfoot, as wood knocking is a supposed behavior they use to intimidate and possibly communicate with each other. Is that what was going on here? It certainly seems that whatever it was, it may have meant them harm. Another strange wood-knocking type case comes from a poster calling himself Pacarino Romano, who says that at the time, he was in federal law enforcement, and on this occasion, he was out camping with his friend out in the Kyriakos National Monument area of southeastern Arizona. As they were hiking, he says that the weather got unseasonably foggy and gloomy all of a sudden, and that was when the bizarre series of events would play out, starting with what sounded like rock knocking. The witness says this: "Shortly after the fog came in, the last part of the bad weather changed. We heard a strange set of 3 knocking noises from behind a hanging rock at the top of the gorge that we were in at that point. It sounded vaguely like a heavy tool being slammed against the rock in the cadence of 2 knocks a quarter second apart, a short second delay, then a third knock. This 3-knock sequence repeated several times from that location. We stopped as soon as we heard it, and we were immediately made uneasy for some reason. After several sets of knocks, it stopped, and we started moving about 50 yards, when we heard the same several set of knocks from the opposite side of the gorge, then again from a third position that was once again above us on the rim of the gorge, near some large monolithic rocks. We then had a very uneasy and frightening feeling. My friend told me something to the effect of, 'Hurry up and let's get out of here. I don't like this,' and we started moving out of there at a constant jog. For the next 5 minutes, we heard a few more sets of knocks from the 3 different locations. I felt very much in danger for my life for some reason. At one point we stopped at an outcropping on the rim of the gorge. We both had our hands on our holsters and did a quick look at the ridge above us. We had instinctively grabbed cover before doing so. That shows just how disturbed we were. When we made it to the trail crossroads at the end of the loop near the visitor center, we had lost the feeling of dread about a half a mile back. We went to the visitor center and asked the ranger if there were any crews working in the area or any groups of people doing something that sounded like the knocking we described. She said it sounded like we heard woodpeckers. I played my roommate a clip of a woodpecker native in the area via YouTube on my phone, and the sound was vaguely similar, but the tapping of the woodpecker was much faster, and it wasn't quite as deep-toned. He said, "Well, that does sound like it. We probably just heard that and got freaked out." I didn't agree, but I felt as if it would be embarrassing to admit that I still felt that something very weird actually happened, so I feigned agreement. We then drove home. The two later decided that what they had heard was not in fact woodpeckers, and were left to wonder what was out there stalking them. Another poster recalls a strange experience he had when he was living in a rural town in the southwest corner of Missouri in the U.S., which was surrounded by hills, woods, and ravines. One summer day, he went out for a walk in the woods near his home along with his dog, a pit bull named Fatty, and as they made their way through a creek bed, the dog began whining and cowering for no discernible reason. Thinking that there was a wild animal out there, the witness stopped to listen, only to find the woods eerily devoid of any sounds at all. No wind or birds or anything at all, which was very weird because even on a calm day, the forest would usually be teeming with sounds of life. He stood there for a few minutes in that spooky silence. The only sound was his whining dog, which was also odd in that the animal was usually fearless and afraid of nothing. And then he felt a creeping sensation that gave him the distinct impression that he was being watched, an ominous feeling that he could not shake. Yet, although every fiber of his being told him to get out of there, he instead felt a strange urge to keep going deeper into the trees, and he explains the series of bizarre events that would follow next. All signs pointed to leaving, right? But no. Another weird thing happened. Call it being an edgy teenager or something else, but I felt this strange pull into the woods. There was no sound, but I felt like something was calling me, luring me deeper into the woods. It was the creepiest thing I had ever felt in my life, but I was so curious. I wanted to know what the hell wanted me to wander further ahead. I walked forward, aware that my dog had firmly planted his feet at the fallen trees. He was shaking all over and yelped at me as I walked away, but he didn't come with me. He also didn't leave, which I believed potentially saved my ass that day. I left Fatty behind and eventually got to the part of the creek that I had never been to. It was a clearing with a ring of trees surrounding it, with the creek stretching far ahead and going around an unseen corner. The sun hadn't moved, and it was still silent. I stood in place for a minute and considered turning around. The clearing was creepy and felt devoid of everything. I can't explain it well enough. I felt like if I walked around that corner, which was just about 100 feet away, that something terrible would happen. I felt like something was just waiting for me to walk into it, unsuspecting. I brushed it off as paranoia. I had plenty of sunlight left, and I could explore alone for once. Besides, if something was drawing me in further, I might find something amazing. I took a couple more steps, and suddenly I heard my dog yelping frantically behind me. Startled, I turned around quickly, my dog looking a little like a white speck far back in the trees. He was pacing back and forth at his spot and barking like it would kill him if he didn't take off running. He kept lunging forward, but wouldn't move any distance forward. I finally realized that something was very wrong. I turned around again to look back at the clearing. It was pitch black outside. I kid you not. Seconds ago, the sun wasn't even close to going down below the horizon, and now the stars were out. No sun, no light. I stared hard at the trees around the corner, seeing nothing but elongated shadows. I heard a twig snap. All of a sudden, my ears started to ring, and panic flooded my entire body. I whipped around and shot back toward the fallen trees, sprinting towards my dog. He was snarling and barking like mad, and when I ducked under the trees, both of us sprinted back towards the house. The entire time, I felt like I had death on my heels, and Fatty never once ran ahead of me, staying right at my side the entire way back. When I made it home, I checked the clock. During a walk that usually takes 10 minutes, I had been gone for 3 hours. I'd left my house at 7:30 and arrived home at 10:30. My parents were due home in an hour. The next day I walked only partway back to where I could see the clearing. The very farthest I could have walked was about 2 miles, and it took 3 hours. I don't know what wanted me in the woods that day. I didn't see what it was, and it said nothing to me, but I ignored every natural instinct I had to run until it was almost too late. My dog being there may have been the reason I didn't wander deep into the woods of Missouri and succumb to someone or something in the dark. What was after him out in those woods, drawing him in for unknown reasons? Was he perhaps in danger of becoming another person who vanished without a trace? From another witness called Ukla the Mock comes an experience that allegedly happened on a camping trip with a youth group in the state of New Hampshire. At the end of the 2-day trip, he took a hike by himself down the hill to an area with a makeshift archery range in order to tear it down. He made a pile of garbage and equipment to bring back to camp and was about to head back when he says that all the sounds in the forest just suddenly ceased, as if a curtain of silence had just fallen down around him. He then says that he could sense a sort of humming sensation, and that is when things would unfold into a terrifying experience. The witness says this: "For some inexplicable reason, I had snapped my head to the right to view the tree line, and noticed there was an area with thinner brush, like an opening, and I started walking toward it, like I was being drawn. As I cleared the tree line and stepped into the woods proper, I could feel the pull to go deeper into the woods become much stronger. Looking ahead, the woods were in deep shadow, with a strange group of 4 trees about 75 feet away, lit by a shaft of light beaming at an angle from above. The light wasn't the normal afternoon yellow sunlight, but a very strange golden color. The light hit the trees in a way that the bases of the trees were glowing in a beckoning way, with the rest of the woods in shadow and the trees lit up. It created a weird tunnel vision. The compulsion to go investigate the 4 trees was now almost overwhelming. The thought of, 'Come see, come quickly, come right now,' was insistent. My head was pounding, like a headache without the pain. As I was about to take another step forward, another separate feeling from the depths of my being started screaming at me to stop immediately. I instantly, viscerally, knew that despite how enticing this call was, if I proceeded forward towards those trees, I would be lost to the world. That specific impression, lost to the world, scared me deeply. The feeling of, this is not right, and danger, were palpable to me. This somehow overrode my compulsion. I quickly looked backwards to the opening, and I could see the boughs sitting on the ground, and I think seeing a bit of reality helped me break the hold of the call. I suddenly felt a hollow pit in my stomach, and I started tracing a path slowly backwards towards the opening. I kept my eyes on those trees, like I was facing down a predator. I didn't want to turn my back on them. I couldn't turn my back on them. Making it back, I stepped through the opening to the archery range, my head almost instantly clearing. I could again hear noises from the camp and feel the wind. I looked at where I had just stepped from, and I now felt normal. I immediately grabbed the first load of equipment and headed back to camp. For some reason, I didn't tell anyone at the camp what I experienced. On my subsequent trip to get the last load of equipment, absolutely everything was normal, but I stayed the hell away from that opening. What stands out to me is the lost to the world impression. It was so clear and ominous and final. I can't express how truly drawn I was to go deeper into those woods, the feeling to give myself over to it, whatever it was. I do know that something not good would have happened if I hadn't heeded the warning. I know that my experience was very real and very scary. I'm also convinced that I wouldn't have come out if I had kept going that day. In another case, poster Bellabina143 describes how she was 11 years old when she had her own such brush with the unexplained. She says that she and her family would go out camping in the woods of New Hampshire in their camping trailer every summer, and it was during one of these excursions that something very odd would happen. She says that one time during one of these camping trips, her aunt woke up and asked if she remembered what had happened the previous evening, to which she replied, no, she did not. It was then that the aunt, father, and mother would tell her what had transpired, which was creepy, to say the least, and this is what the witness had to say. My aunt was a bit shaky, as she asked, "Do you remember what happened last night?" I shook my head no, and listened as my aunt told me about the extremely strange night, which I did not recall whatsoever. My aunt explained that at about 2 a.m., she woke up to the door of the camper being wide open. She quickly checked the bunks and noticed that I was nowhere to be found. She woke up my mom and dad, and then my mom and dad got flashlights and started frantically searching for me outside, around the immediate area. My aunt stayed behind because there were still 4 kids sleeping in the camper. After a scary 10-minute search, my dad spotted me. I had walked out of the camper and into the trees about 30 feet away. It was far enough that I could not be seen unless he walked into the trees a bit. I was just standing out there in the dark, with my eyes completely open, but not responding to him at all. I had no shoes, no flashlight, and was wearing just shorts and a t-shirt. He said that he grabbed my hand and started walking me back to the camp. He remembers asking me, "What's going on? Why in the world would you go out on your own like that?" Then I finally spoke up, saying, "I need to wait here, Dad. Let's just stay here." My mom remembers that I then started crying, as she and my dad led me back to the camper. Whenever I think back to this story, I get a sick, strange feeling. Thank God my aunt woke up when she did. It's important to note that I've never been known to sleepwalk before or after that night. It was an isolated incident, which could have had a very different ending had I not been so lucky. My mom was so upset that she decided to get rid of the trailer, and we didn't do much camping after that night. Another strange account comes from Nicaragua that seems to involve some sort of forest entities. Poster Monkey85 claims that when she was just 6 years old, she was staying with her grandmother on a huge plantation, surrounded by thick rainforest. On one bright, clear day, she was out along a trail with her parents, walking from their Jeep back to the plantation, and she describes what happened next. I remember playing with one of my favorite toys. It was the Green Ranger, that you could push a button and its head would switch from its normal head to its helmet. Anyways, I was playing with it as we walked along the trail, and then arrived to a small stream. My parents are easily able to jump over it and keep walking. They looked behind them, and I could see them watch me trying to make the jump while smiling at me. I made the jump over the stream, but I dropped my toy in the process, and it got picked up by the stream, so I immediately started following after it. I could hear my parents yelling for me, but I was too focused on catching up to my toy. The next bit I still remember vividly to this day. All of a sudden I'm in a field with very tall grass. It's surrounded by trees. The one thing I notice is that it's eerily quiet. I have to reiterate that this is a Central American forest. It is never quiet. There are always hundreds of birds, monkeys, and other small animals everywhere. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. Then I hear something weird, like chirping, and I see small tiny orbs in the grass. I'm not afraid of them, more like intrigued. They're amongst the grass like the way you would see an animal's eyes, but they're weightless and floating. I start walking toward them, but then I get scared and run away towards the forest. I remember getting sleepy as I fell against a tree trunk. According to the witness, she then actually went missing for a full 2 days, as her family frantically searched for her. It was thought that she had been kidnapped, since her father was rather rich, but there was never a ransom given. A massive search was launched for her, involving the police, military, about 1,000 people total combing the jungle, dogs, helicopters, the works, but no trace of her was found. Although she didn't remember anything of what happened during those 2 days, she does recall how she suddenly woke to find herself on a bus by herself, and then she explains, "I was missing for 2 days, and the next thing I remember, I was waking up in the back of a bus. The bus driver was waking me up and asking if I was okay. I immediately started crying and asking for my mom. My mom had me memorize our home number, so they called it and I got picked up. Police investigate, thinking it may have been a kidnapping attempt. I tell them my story, and a few of them think duendas took me. Duendas is something a lot of people in Nicaragua believe in, especially people out in the fields. It's less believed in the major cities. They're basically described as small people who kidnap children, kill livestock, or ruin crops. Basically, mischievous little things. A telltale sign of them being present is seeing small floating lights in trees or among tall grass. People say it's their lanterns that they carry. The last story that I'd like to share with you tonight focuses on a case that involved what many believe to be an abduction by some sort of creature, rather than an unseen force or entity. This bizarre report was related by the prominent author on Vanished People, David Paulides, author of the Missing 411 series of books, in an interview for Paranormal Central, and is a case that comes from the year 1868, when a 3-year-old girl suddenly went missing in northern Michigan as she was at a lumber camp run by her father. According to the father, she had been there 1 second and then gone the next, as if she had simply blinked from existence. A search was launched, during which the panicked father enlisted the help of 2 hunters to try and find his young daughter, lost out alone in the woods. The girl's name was called over and over again into the thick forest, as night slowly crept in on them, yet no answer came back. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. With the onset of darkness, the search was called off until the next morning, with no trace of where the young girl had gone off to. The next day the search continued, and the hunters were hard at work, scouring the woods for any sign of the missing girl. As they trudged through rugged, dense wilderness, they allegedly heard the shouts of a young girl coming from nearby, which sounded muffled and muted somehow, like sounds coming from farther away than they were, as if through some veil or blanket. The hunters claimed that they followed the source of the shouts to a river, and as they fought through the brush, they could hear a large splash, after which they saw an enormous black shape that they took to be perhaps a bear, entering the water and swimming toward the opposite shore. As they stared in shock at this retreating beast, they noticed the girl standing upon a nearby log, minus some articles of clothing. When the girl was recovered, she seemed to be rather shaken up, and claimed that the creature they had seen was named Mr. Wolf, and that he had been holding her prisoner there. She claimed that this Mr. Wolf had eaten her hat, taken her shoes, and had refused to let her leave under any circumstances, although he had also provided her with berries to eat. It is unclear whether this was a bear, a wolf, or something else, and the story certainly seems rather bizarre. What was this Mr. Wolf, and what did he want? The amount of bizarre encounters that people have had with being almost taken, or taken and then returned, is staggering, and in my opinion, it's the commonalities between the cases that make them so unnerving. I try to see everything through a rational, yet open-minded lens, and while some of these events could be relegated to possible confusion and disorientation, the similarities point to a much more real and disturbing trend. Even if we downplay it, and assume that only 1% of the cases around the world involve something paranormal and possibly malevolent, it would mean that there is in fact something happening in and around our forests and wild places. Something that deserves to be feared. I realize that I focused heavily on people that were almost missing, rather than people who were never found. But in many ways we can learn from their stories, and possibly identify ways to avoid becoming lost ourselves. Our hearts go out to the hundreds and thousands of people that go missing every day, and we will no doubt be coming back to this topic many more times in the future. If you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable, and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember, no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. You can also connect with us by joining our forum and by following us on social media. All of our contact information can be found in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your friends. If you're interested in taking the next step and becoming a patron, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast are produced every Sunday, with the new midweek mysteries airing every Wednesday, and they're available on all of your favorite podcast apps. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, thank you so much for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.